My name is Rex Calder. Tonight, as the storm settles over us, I need to share something with you. Something that's been keeping me awake for weeks now. What I'm about to tell you isn't speculation. It isn't theory. Every document, every victim's name, every CIA memo I'll read to you tonight has been verified through decades of Freedom of Information Act requests, congressional investigations, and court settlements. Recently discovered connections between declassified MKUltra documents reveal a coordinated pattern that investigators have missed for decades. By connecting dots across 50 years of released files, we can finally see how Operation Midnight Climax, Dr. Cameron's psychic driving experiments, and the Lexington narcotics farm weren't isolated horrors. They were three prongs of a systematic assault on human consciousness. So settle in, let the storm wash over you, and let me guide you through the documented evidence of what our government actually did to its own people. But before we crack open the sleep files tonight, I've got a small request. If these deep dive tales of conspiracy and hidden history are pulling you down the rabbit hole with me, tap that like button and hit subscribe. It may feel like a trivial click, but every one of them helps us pry another secret loose and keeps these stories coming. And while you're here, tell me where on earth you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the globe. There's something quietly conspiratorial about tracking the hours and locales of our little global community. So, go on, drop your city and your time in the comments. Who knows what patterns we might uncover together. Now, let's see what the government left on the cutting room floor. Welcome to the Sleep Files. 1953, a gray morning in Washington, D.C. CIA Director Alan Dulles sits across from his chief chemist, Sidney Gottlieb. On the desk between them, a single-page memo. At the top, stamped in red ink, MKUltra. Gottlieb was an unusual man for a spy. He stuttered. He had a club foot. He raised goats on his farm in Virginia and practiced folk dancing. But Alan Dulles had chosen him for one specific reason. Sidney Gottlieb had no moral boundaries when it came to the human mind. The memo was simple. Find a way to control human consciousness. Budget, unlimited. Oversight, none. Methods, whatever it takes. What they created over the next 20 years was a program so vast, so brutal, that when investigators finally pieced it together in the 1970s, they could barely believe what they found. 149 separate sub-projects, 80 institutions, 44 colleges and universities, $25 million in 1950s money, and hundreds of victims who never knew they were being experimented on. The first casualty came just 7 months after that April meeting. His name was Frank Olson. Frank was a biochemist, worked for the Army at Fort Detrick, developing biological weapons. On November 19th, 1953, he attended a weekend retreat with his CIA colleagues at Deep Creek Lodge in rural Maryland. After dinner, Sidney Gottlieb served cognac. What Frank didn't know was that his drink had been laced with 25 micrograms of LSD. For the next 9 days, Frank Olson descended into paranoid psychosis. He became convinced the CIA was going to destroy his career, maybe even kill him. He was probably right. On November 28, 1953, at 2:30 in the morning, Frank Olson crashed through the window of room 1018A at the Statler Hotel in New York City. Fell 13 floors to his death. The CIA called it suicide. Told his family he'd had a nervous breakdown. For 22 years, Alice Olson believed her husband had simply snapped. Then, in 1975, the Church Committee began investigating CIA domestic activities, and Alice Olson learned the truth. Her husband had been murdered, not by enemy agents, not by foreign spies, by his own government, by men he'd worked with for years. The Olson family sued. In 1976, they received a settlement of $750,000 and a personal apology from President Gerald Ford. But Frank Olson was just the beginning. What investigators discovered next was a program so comprehensive, so systematically cruel, that it challenged everything Americans believed about their government. MKUltra had turned American citizens into unwitting test subjects, college students, mental patients, prisoners, prostitutes, anyone vulnerable, anyone disposable. The goal was simple. Break the human mind, then rebuild it under government control. And they came terrifyingly close to succeeding. Section 2, Operation Midnight Climax, 1954 Telegraph Hill, San Francisco. In a nondescript apartment overlooking the bay, CIA agent George Hunter White has just finished installing one-way mirrors in the bedroom walls. White wasn't your typical intelligence officer. Before the CIA, he'd been a federal narcotics agent. Rough around the edges, comfortable with moral ambiguity. Perfect for what Sidney Gottlieb had in mind. The apartment on Telegraph Hill would become the first CIA-operated brothel in American history. The operation was called Midnight Climax. The concept was elegant in its brutality. Hire prostitutes to slip LSD to their clients, then observe the effects through hidden cameras and one-way glass. White recruited his girls from the North Beach area. Street-smart women who needed money and weren't afraid of bending rules. He paid them $100 a day, good money in the 50s, plus immunity from prosecution. The clients were random. Businessmen looking for a good time. Sailors on shore leave. Married men who'd never dreamed their government was watching. White would sit behind his one-way mirror with a pitcher of martinis, taking notes as ordinary Americans lost their minds. The doses were massive. Up to 200 micrograms of LSD slipped into drinks. For comparison, Timothy Leary recommended 25 micrograms for a spiritual experience. These men were getting 8 times that amount without warning. Some clients became violent, others catatonic. A few tried to leave but found the door locked. White would watch them claw at the walls, begging to be released, while he sipped his cocktail and scribbled observations. One man, a traveling salesman from Ohio, spent 6 hours convinced the prostitute was his dead mother. He sat in the corner, weeping, having an extended conversation with someone who wasn't there. Another client, a Navy ensign on leave, became convinced that spiders were crawling under his skin. He scratched himself bloody while White documented every minute of his breakdown. The operation ran for nearly a decade. White expanded to apartments in New York's Greenwich Village, added microphones to record audio. Experimented with different drugs, mescaline, psilocybin, a cocktail of stimulants and depressants. The prostitutes weren't just employees. They were guinea pigs, too. White encouraged them to sample the drugs, then observed how it affected their performance. Several developed serious addictions. At least 2 suffered permanent psychological damage. But the most disturbing aspect of Midnight Climax wasn't the illegal drugging or the film's sexual encounters. It was how ordinary it became for the people involved. George White kept detailed journals throughout the operation. In them, he describes dosing unwitting citizens with the casual tone of a farmer discussing livestock. Subject exhibited typical onset symptoms. He'd write, "Paranoid ideation increased after 90 minutes, suggests doubling dosage for future trials." These weren't enemy spies. They weren't volunteers. They were American citizens whose only crime was seeking companionship in the wrong neighborhood. When Midnight Climax finally shut down in 1965, White had documented the destruction of hundreds of lives. Men who went home to their families forever changed. Some divorced. Others drank themselves to death. A few simply disappeared. The files were buried in CIA archives for over a decade. The victims never knew what had happened to them. They just knew that one night in San Francisco, they'd lost their minds and never quite gotten them back. George White retired with a full pension and a commendation for his service. He died in 1975, just as congressional investigators began uncovering his work. At his funeral, his CIA handler delivered a eulogy praising White's dedication to national security. He never mentioned the broken men left in his wake. But Midnight Climax was just one spoke in a much larger wheel. While White was destroying minds in San Francisco, a Canadian psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron was conducting experiments so brutal that they would make Midnight Climax look humane by comparison. Section 2, Dr. Cameron's Psychic Driving. Montreal, Quebec, 1957. Val Orlikow walks through the doors of the Allen Memorial Institute seeking treatment for postpartum depression. She's a young mother married to a member of the Canadian Parliament. Educated, middle class, trusting. She has no idea she's about to become the subject of experiments that will destroy her mind and shatter her family. The Allen Memorial Institute was part of McGill University, one of Canada's most prestigious medical schools. But in the 1950s, it had become something else entirely. A CIA-funded laboratory for breaking human consciousness. The man in charge was Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, one of the most respected psychiatrists in the world. He'd been president of the American Psychiatric Association. He'd served as a psychiatric examiner at the Nuremberg trials. He was the co-founder of the World Psychiatric Association. He was also a monster. Cameron had a theory he called psychic driving. The human mind, he believed, was like a computer that could be wiped clean and reprogrammed. All you had to do was destroy the existing personality completely, then rebuild it from scratch. The CIA was very interested in this theory. So interested that they funneled over $300,000 to Cameron's research through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Cameron's method was simple in concept, horrifying in execution. First, he would depattern his patients, destroy their existing personalities through a combination of massive electroshock, sensory deprivation, and drug-induced comas. Then, once their minds were blank slates, he would reprogram them using endless loops of recorded messages played through speakers embedded in their pillows. Val Orlico became patient VM88. Her treatment began with what Cameron called intensive electroshock therapy, not the careful, controlled ECT used in modern medicine. Cameron administered up to 40 electroshock treatments in a single day, using voltages far beyond standard practice. The goal wasn't to treat depression, it was to erase Val's personality entirely. After 3 weeks of intensive electroshock, Val no longer recognized her husband. She couldn't remember her children's names. She was incontinent, unable to speak in full sentences, reduced to the mental capacity of a small child. Cameron noted in her file, "Depatterning successful. Patient exhibits complete memory loss and childlike dependency. Ready for psychic driving phase." Val was then placed in what Cameron called differential amnesia therapy. She was kept in a drug-induced coma for weeks at a time, fed intravenously while speakers played the same messages over and over, 18 hours a day. "You are a good wife and mother," the voice would repeat. "You love your husband. You are happy with your life. You are a good wife and mother." The messages weren't therapeutic. They were CIA scripts designed to create a compliant, controllable personality. Val wasn't alone. Cameron was running similar experiments on dozens of patients. Linda McDonald, a 25-year-old woman admitted for minor anxiety, received 109 electroshock treatments in 86 days. She emerged unable to read, write, or remember any part of her life before entering the hospital. Mary Morrow, a depressed housewife, spent 6 months in a drug-induced coma while messages played constantly in her ears. When she woke up, she spoke only in short, repetitive phrases pulled from Cameron's scripts. Robert Loggy, a businessman suffering from mild depression, underwent Cameron's full program. When he was finally released, he had the mental capacity of a 10-year-old and had to be toilet trained by his wife. But perhaps the most disturbing case was that of Jean Steele, a young nurse who voluntarily admitted herself for work-related stress. Cameron diagnosed her with schizophrenia, a complete fabrication, and subjected her to his entire experimental protocol. 57 electroshock treatments, 3 months in a drug-induced coma, 6 months of psychic driving. When Jean Steele left the Allen Memorial Institute, she was no longer the woman who had entered. She moved like a robot, spoke in monotone, and showed no emotion whatsoever. Her fiancé broke off their engagement. Her family couldn't cope with the stranger she'd become. Jean Steele committed suicide in 1961, 3 years after her treatment ended. Cameron noted her death in his files as patient exhibited unexpected resistance to programming. The experiments continued for nearly a decade. Cameron published papers describing his work in respected medical journals. He spoke at conferences, presenting his breakthrough methods to audiences of psychiatrists and psychologists. The medical community should have been horrified. Instead, many were fascinated. Cameron's papers were widely cited. His techniques were adopted by other researchers. The idea that human personality could be erased and rebuilt was seen as revolutionary, not abhorrent. What the medical community didn't know was that Cameron's research was funded by the CIA. Every breakthrough he published was shared with Langley. Every technique he developed was evaluated for potential use in interrogation and control. The agency was particularly interested in Cameron's work with children. Starting in 1958, he began admitting children as young as 5 years old to his program. The CIA wanted to know, could you program a personality from scratch if you started early enough? The answer, based on Cameron's files, appears to be yes. Children subjected to Cameron's methods showed even more complete personality erasure than adults. Their young minds were more malleable, easier to reprogram. Several children emerged from treatment with entirely fabricated memories and personalities created by Cameron's scripts. The CIA was delighted. Here was proof that human consciousness could be controlled, shaped, directed. All you needed was the right combination of trauma, drugs, and repetition. Cameron continued his work until 1964, when changing attitudes towards psychiatric research finally made his methods too controversial to continue. By then, he'd destroyed hundreds of lives in pursuit of the perfect technique for controlling human minds. He retired with honors, praised by colleagues for his innovative contributions to psychiatry. He never acknowledged the suffering he'd caused, never apologized to his victims, never admitted that his treatments were actually torture disguised as medicine. Cameron died in 1967, taking his secrets with him, but his victims lived on, their minds permanently shattered by experiments that should never have been allowed to happen. While Orlikov spent the rest of her life struggling with memory problems and personality changes caused by Cameron's treatments, she eventually joined a lawsuit against the CIA, seeking compensation for what had been done to her. In 1988, 31 years after entering the Allen Memorial Institute, Val finally received a settlement. The CIA paid her and 8 other victims a total of $750,000. It was the first time the agency officially acknowledged that Cameron's work had been torture, not treatment. But Cameron's experiments were just one part of MKUltra's assault on human consciousness. While he was destroying minds in Montreal, another group of CIA-funded researchers was conducting equally brutal experiments at a federal prison in Kentucky. Section 2, Lexington Narcotics Farm, Lexington, Kentucky, 1958. The federal narcotics farm sits on 1,000 acres of rolling Kentucky farmland surrounded by white wooden fences that make it look more like a country club than a prison. But for the addicts confined here, it's become something far worse than either. It's become a laboratory where CIA researchers are conducting some of the most brutal drug experiments in American history. The narcotics farm was officially a treatment facility designed to help drug addicts overcome their dependencies through work therapy and medical care. In reality, it was a captive population of vulnerable people, perfect for MKUltra's purposes. The man running the experiments was Dr. Harris Isbell, a respected addiction researcher who'd been studying drug effects on humans for over a decade. What made Isbell perfect for MKUltra wasn't his medical expertise, it was his willingness to ignore every ethical boundary in medical research. Isbell's subjects were primarily African-American men, arrested for drug possession and sentenced to indefinite detention at Lexington. They had no legal representation, no family visits, no way to complain about their treatment. They were, in Isbell's words, perfect research material. The experiments began simply enough. Isbell would offer inmates small privileges, cigarettes, better food, slightly more comfortable accommodations in exchange for participating in drug studies. Most agreed, desperate for any improvement in their harsh conditions. What they didn't know was that Isbell wasn't studying addiction treatment. He was conducting CIA-funded research into mind-controlled drugs, using human subjects like laboratory rats. The first phase involved LSD dosing on a scale that dwarfed even the Midnight Climax experiments. Isbell administered doses up to 10 times stronger than Cameron used in Montreal, keeping subjects under the influence of hallucinogens for days or weeks at a time. One subject, identified in CIA files only as Patient 47, was kept on continuous LSD for 77 consecutive days. Every morning, Isbell would inject him with a fresh dose and observe and document his psychological deterioration. By day 30, Patient 47 was no longer responding to verbal commands. By day 50, he'd lost the ability to feed himself. By day 70, he was catatonic, staring at the ceiling and occasionally mumbling fragments of childhood memories. Isbell noted in his files, subject appears to have achieved complete ego dissolution, will maintain current dosage to observe long-term effects. But LSD was just the beginning. Isbell experimented with every psychoactive substance the CIA could provide. DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, PCP, combinations of hallucinogens and stimulants, cocktails of drugs that had never been tested on humans. The goal was to find substances that could break down psychological resistance, making subjects compliant and suggestible. The CIA wanted the perfect interrogation drug, something that would make enemy agents tell the truth without realizing what they were doing. Isbell's most horrifying experiments involved what he called successive approximation. gradually conditioning subjects to respond to increasingly bizarre commands while under the influence of various drug combinations. He would start with simple instructions. Raise your right hand, then progressively more complex. Count backwards from 100. Eventually, tell me about your childhood. Finally, confess your crimes against the state. The conditioning worked. Subjects who initially resisted Isbell's commands eventually became completely compliant, following any instruction no matter how humiliating or self-destructive. One man, identified as Subject B19, was conditioned to bark like a dog whenever he heard a specific tone. Another was programmed to strip naked and assume a fetal position when exposed to certain light patterns. A third would compulsively confess to crimes he'd never committed whenever someone said the word truth. These weren't temporary effects. Follow-up studies conducted years later found that many of Isbell's subjects retained their programmed responses long after leaving Lexington. Their minds had been permanently altered by the conditioning process. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Isbell's work was his complete indifference to his subjects' suffering. His research files, obtained through FOIA requests in the 1980s, read like the notes of a scientist studying insects rather than human beings. Subject exhibited intense paranoid ideation beginning hour 6, he would write. Increased dosage to observe progression of symptoms. Subject now convinced that insects are crawling under his skin. Self-mutilation observed and documented. Will continue current protocol. The men at Lexington weren't just guinea pigs. They were disposable guinea pigs. African-American drug addicts in the segregated South with no legal protections and no one to advocate for their rights. If they died during experiments, which several did, their deaths were listed as complications from withdrawal or pre-existing conditions. Isbell ran his experiments for over a decade, dosing thousands of men with mind-altering substances. He published papers on his work in medical journals, carefully omitting details about the CIA funding or the non-consensual nature of many experiments. The research continued until 1963, when changing attitudes toward human experimentation finally made Isbell's methods too controversial to continue. By then, he'd established the basic principles that would guide CIA mind control research for years to come. First, the human mind could be broken through sustained chemical assault. Second, broken minds could be reprogrammed using behavioral conditioning. Third, the effects were often permanent, creating subjects who remained controllable long after treatment ended. These findings weren't abstract scientific discoveries, they were operational intelligence, used to develop interrogation techniques and psychological warfare methods that the CIA deployed around the world. Isbell retired in 1963 with full honors from the medical establishment. He was praised for his contributions to addiction research and his innovative studies of human consciousness. No one mentioned the thousands of men whose minds he destroyed in the process. The subjects of Isbell's experiments fared less well. Most served their full sentences at Lexington, then returned to lives complicated by the psychological damage from their time as unwitting test subjects. Many became homeless. Others committed suicide. A few disappeared entirely, their fates unknown. In 1977, when congressional investigators finally uncovered the extent of MKUltra's activities, they found extensive documentation of Isbell's work. But by then, most of his subjects were dead, and the survivors were too damaged or too afraid to come forward. The CIA destroyed most of its MKUltra files in 1973, when incoming director William Colby ordered the records eliminated to prevent embarrassment to the agency. But enough survived to paint a clear picture of what had happened at Lexington. It wasn't medical research, it wasn't addiction treatment. It was systematic torture disguised as science and funded by the American government. Isbell died in 1991, having never publicly acknowledged the true nature of his work at Lexington. His obituary and medical journals praised his decades of service to addiction medicine. It made no mention of the CIA experiments or the lives destroyed in pursuit of mind control. But the techniques developed at Lexington didn't die with Isbell. They lived on in CIA training manuals, in military interrogation protocols, in the dark corners of America's intelligence apparatus, where conscience goes to die. Section 3. The pattern emerges. By 1963, MKUltra had been running for a decade. 3 separate programs, Midnight Climax, Cameron's Psychic Driving, and Isbell's Prison Experiments, had produced a massive body of research on human consciousness and control. What emerges when you study these programs together isn't just a catalog of individual horrors. It's a systematic blueprint for breaking the human mind. The pattern was elegant in its brutality. First, identify vulnerable populations: prostitutes and their clients in San Francisco, mental patients in Montreal, drug addicts in Kentucky, people with no power, no advocates, no ability to fight back. Second, apply maximum psychological stress: massive drug doses, electroshock, sensory deprivation, sexual humiliation, whatever it took to shatter existing personality structures. Third, exploit the resulting vulnerability. Use the moment of maximum psychological breakdown to implant new behaviors, beliefs, or responses. The CIA had accidentally discovered something that interrogators throughout history had known intuitively. The human mind, when pushed beyond its breaking point, becomes extraordinarily malleable. But MKUltra went further than traditional torture. The goal wasn't just to extract information or obtain compliance. It was to achieve permanent control over human consciousness itself. The success rate was horrifying. Across all three programs, researchers reported that roughly 60% of subjects showed lasting personality changes that persisted years after treatment ended. In many cases, these changes appeared to be permanent. More disturbing still was evidence that some subjects could be activated long after their initial programming. A word, a sound, a visual cue could trigger program responses even years later. The implications were staggering. If perfected, these techniques could create armies of unconscious agents, people who would carry out missions without realizing they were being controlled. The ultimate intelligence asset. An agent who didn't know they were an agent. This wasn't science fiction. It was documented science fact, buried in thousands of pages of CIA files that wouldn't see daylight for another decade. But by 1963, the political climate was shifting. President Kennedy had been assassinated. The Warren Commission was asking uncomfortable questions about intelligence operations. Congress was beginning to show interest in CIA activities. Most importantly, Sidney Gottlieb was getting nervous. MKUltra had always operated in legal gray areas, but the moral and ethical violations were becoming impossible to ignore. If the program were ever exposed, it would destroy not just the careers of everyone involved, but the credibility of American intelligence operations worldwide. In 1964, Gottlieb began quietly shutting down the most controversial MKUltra subprojects. Midnight Climax closed its doors. Cameron's experiments wound down. Isbell's prison research shifted to less obvious forms of manipulation. But the knowledge remained. The techniques had been perfected. The blueprint for breaking human consciousness was complete. What happened next was perhaps the most chilling development in the entire MKUltra story. The techniques developed in these experimental programs began appearing in CIA operations around the world. Interrogation methods pioneered on unwitting Americans were deployed against enemy agents in Vietnam, Latin America, and the Middle East. Psychological conditioning techniques developed at Lexington showed up in training manuals for Allied intelligence services. The horrors inflicted on Val Orlikow, Patient 47, and countless others weren't just research experiments. They were product development for tools of oppression that would be used for decades to come. By 1965, MKUltra as a formal program was effectively over, but its legacy was just beginning. The techniques lived on in CIA training programs, in military interrogation protocols, in the standard operating procedures of American intelligence. What started as an experimental program to understand mind control had become an operational capability for implementing it. The transformation was complete. The CIA had weaponized human consciousness itself, and almost no one knew it had happened. Section 4, the cover-up begins. June 21st, 1973, a humid summer morning in Langley, Virginia. CIA Director William Colby sits in his 7th floor office, reading a memo that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The subject line is simple: MKUltra document destruction. The memo from Sidney Gottlieb is equally direct. Recommend immediate destruction of all MKUltra operational files to prevent congressional oversight and public embarrassment. Colby knows what this means. Thousands of documents detailing 2 decades of illegal human experimentation. Files containing the names of victims, researchers, and government officials who authorized the programs. Evidence of crimes that could topple the intelligence community. He signs the order. Over the next 48 hours, CIA employees spend round-the-clock shifts feeding documents into industrial shredders. 20 years of research into human consciousness control, reduced to confetti and scattered to the winds. The timing wasn't coincidental. By 1973, Watergate was unraveling. Congress was asking uncomfortable questions about intelligence operations. Investigative journalists were digging into CIA activities with unprecedented aggressiveness. The last thing the agency needed was public exposure of programs that turned American citizens into unwitting test subjects for mind control experiments. But the document destruction wasn't complete. In the chaos of shredding thousands of files, some boxes were missed. Tucked away in a financial records warehouse, roughly 20,000 pages of MKUltra documents survived the purge. These surviving files would eventually expose the entire program, but that wouldn't happen for another 2 years. In the meantime, the cover-up began in earnest. The first line of defense was simple denial. When researchers tried to follow up on rumors of CIA mind control experiments, they hit walls of official stonewalling. Agencies claimed no knowledge of such programs. Universities denied any involvement with intelligence-funded research. The second line of defense was character assassination. When former victims came forward with stories of government experimentation, they were dismissed as mentally ill, attention-seeking, or simply confused about their treatment. Val Olakow's claims about CIA experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute were labeled paranoid delusions by medical experts. The men who'd suffered through Isbell's prison experiments were dismissed as unreliable witnesses with histories of drug abuse and antisocial behavior. The third line of defense was compartmentalization. Even if some experiments had occurred, officials argued, they were isolated incidents conducted by rogue researchers without government knowledge or approval. This strategy worked remarkably well for nearly 2 years. Public interest in MKUltra remained minimal. News coverage was sporadic and skeptical. The story was too bizarre, too conspiracy-minded for mainstream media to take seriously. Then, in December 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a front-page story in the New York Times that changed everything. The headline read, "Huge CIA operation reported in U.S. against anti-war forces. Other dissidents in Nixon years." Hersh's story exposed Operation Chaos, a massive domestic surveillance program that had spied on thousands of American citizens. But buried in the article were references to drug testing programs and behavioral modification research conducted by the CIA on unwitting subjects. It was the first time MKUltra had been mentioned in mainstream media. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Congressional phone lines were flooded with demands for investigation. Editorial pages called for immediate hearings. Citizens who'd suffered unexplained psychological problems began wondering if they'd been government test subjects. President Gerald Ford, already struggling with Watergate fallout, knew he had to respond. In January 1975, he created the Commission on CIA Activities within the United States, headed by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. The Rockefeller Commission was tasked with investigating all allegations of domestic CIA operations, including the rumored mind control experiments. But the commission was hampered from the start. Most MKUltra documents had been destroyed. Key witnesses were dead or missing. The CIA cooperated minimally, providing only information it couldn't hide. Still, what the commission uncovered was shocking enough. In June 1975, they released a preliminary report confirming that the CIA had indeed conducted drug experiments on unwitting American subjects, resulting in at least one death. The Frank Olson case was finally exposed to public scrutiny. The revelation triggered a political earthquake. If the CIA had murdered one of its own employees with experimental drugs, what had they done to ordinary citizens? How many victims were there? How long had these programs continued? Congress decided it needed its own investigation. In January 1975, the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities was formed, headed by Senator Frank Church of Idaho. The Church Committee, as it became known, would conduct the most thorough investigation of intelligence operations in American history. They had subpoena power, unlimited resources, and a mandate to uncover the truth about CIA domestic activities. What they found would shock the nation and fundamentally change how Americans viewed their government. But the CIA wasn't finished fighting. As the Church Committee began its work, agency officials launched a sophisticated campaign to minimize the damage from any MKUltra revelations. The strategy had 3 components. First, acknowledge only what couldn't be hidden. Admit to some experiments, but claim they were limited in scope and conducted with proper oversight. Second, blame everything on rogue employees. present MKUltra as the unauthorized actions of a few overzealous researchers, not official agency policy. Third, emphasize the Cold War context. Frame the experiments as necessary responses to Soviet mind control research, regrettable but understandable given the existential threat facing America. This carefully crafted narrative would shape public understanding of MKUltra for decades to come. Even today, many accounts of the program repeat CIA talking points from the 1970s. But the Church Committee investigators weren't interested in public relations. They wanted documents, witnesses, and answers. And in August 1975, they got them. Section 5, The Truth Emerges. August 5th, 1975. Room 318 of the Russell Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C. Senator Frank Church gavels the hearing to order as television cameras focus on a witness table where Sidney Gottlieb sits nervously adjusting his tie. After 22 years of operating in the shadows, MKUltra's chief architect is about to face public questioning for the first time. The hearing room is packed. Reporters, congressional staff, and families of suspected victims fill every available seat. In the front row, Alice Olson sits quietly, still seeking answers about her husband's death 22 years earlier. Senator Church's opening statement is measured but pointed. The Central Intelligence Agency drug testing program raises fundamental questions about the value of human life, the integrity of the individual, and the concept of voluntary informed consent. What follows over the next 3 days will expose the American public to horrors they never imagined their government capable of committing. Gottlieb's testimony is a masterclass in evasion and selective memory. He acknowledges that MKUltra existed, but claims it was a small, carefully controlled research program designed to protect American interests during the Cold War. When pressed about specific experiments, Gottlieb repeatedly claims he doesn't remember details. When shown CIA memos bearing his signature, he says he doesn't recall writing them. When asked about the death of Frank Olson, he expresses regret but denies personal responsibility. The committee isn't buying it. Senator Church produces document after document proving that Gottlieb personally approved some of the most brutal experiments in MKUltra's history. The smoking gun comes in the form of a memo dated April 15th, 1953. In it, Gottlieb explicitly authorizes research into techniques of activation of the human individual by remote control and the development of a capability in the covert use of biological and chemical materials. The language is clinical, but the meaning is clear. The CIA was developing ways to control human behavior without the subject's knowledge or consent. As the hearing progresses, the true scope of MKUltra begins to emerge. Not the limited research program Gottlieb describes, but a vast network of experiments involving dozens of institutions and hundreds of unwitting subjects. The committee presents evidence of LSD experiments at psychiatric hospitals where patients seeking treatment for depression were instead subjected to weeks of hallucinogenic torture. They document drug testing at universities, where college students were recruited for psychological research that actually involved dangerous doses of experimental chemicals. They reveal the existence of CIA-operated brothels, where prostitutes dosed customers with LSD while agency employees filmed their breakdowns. Each revelation is more shocking than the last. But the most disturbing testimony comes from the victims themselves. Linda McDonald takes the witness stand on the second day of hearings. She's 37 years old now, but speaks with the halting voice of someone much younger. The electroshock treatments at the Allen Memorial Institute have left her with permanent memory problems and the emotional development of a child. She tells the committee about entering Dr. Cameron's hospital as a young mother seeking treatment for anxiety. She describes waking up months later with no memory of her previous life, unable to recognize her husband or remember her children's names. I lost 26 years of my life, she says quietly. My childhood, my education, my marriage, the birth of my children, all of it gone. I'm not the same person who walked into that hospital. That woman died, and I'm what's left. Her testimony is devastating. Several committee members are visibly shaken. The television audience watching at home is getting its first glimpse of what government mind control experiments actually do to human beings. But Linda McDonald isn't the only victim to testify. Over the next 2 days, the committee hears from a parade of damaged lives. Men who were dosed with LSD in CIA brothels, patients who were subjected to electroshock torture in psychiatric hospitals, prisoners who were used as guinea pigs for experimental drugs. The pattern is always the same. Vulnerable people seeking help or caught in desperate circumstances, exploited by researchers who saw them as expendable test subjects rather than human beings. The public reaction is immediate and overwhelming. Newspaper editorials call for criminal prosecutions. Religious leaders condemn the experiments as violations of basic human dignity. Psychiatrists and psychologists demand investigations into their own profession's complicity. Most importantly, other victims begin coming forward. The church committee hearings have given them validation that their experiences were real, not delusions or psychological problems. Phone calls and letters pour into congressional offices from people who suspect they were subjects in government experiments. A man who lost 3 days of memory after visiting a prostitute in San Francisco. A woman who developed personality changes after voluntary admission to a psychiatric hospital. A former prisoner who remembers being given strange injections during his incarceration. Not all of these claims are credible, but enough are verifiable to suggest that MKUltra's victim count is far higher than even the committee suspected. The CIA, meanwhile, is in full damage control mode. Director William Colby appears before the committee on the final day of hearings to deliver the agency's official response. Colby's testimony is a careful balancing act. He acknowledges that regrettable experiments occurred, but emphasizes that they were conducted in a different era under different leadership. He apologizes to victims while maintaining that the research was motivated by legitimate national security concerns. Most importantly, he assures the committee that such experiments have been permanently discontinued and could never happen again under current CIA policies. The committee's final report, released in April 1976, is a scathing indictment of both MKUltra specifically and intelligence operations generally. It documents clear violations of law, medical ethics, and basic human rights. The report makes dozens of recommendations for preventing future abuses. Stronger oversight, clearer legal guidelines, mandatory reporting of human experiments, and criminal penalties for researchers who violate ethical standards. But the most important outcome of the Church Committee hearings isn't legislative reform. It's public awareness. For the first time, Americans understand that their own government has conducted systematic experiments on unwitting citizens. The psychological impact is profound. If the CIA could dose random citizens with LSD, electroshock psychiatric patients into amnesia, and operate brothels for human experimentation, what else might they be capable of? Trust in government institutions, already damaged by Watergate and Vietnam, reaches new lows. Conspiracy theories proliferate. Alternative media thrives. The idea that official denials might be lies becomes mainstream. The Church Committee has exposed MKUltra, but in doing so, it has also exposed something larger. The willingness of American intelligence agencies to treat their own citizens as expendable assets in the pursuit of operational advantage. That revelation will reshape American politics for decades to come. But for the victims of MKUltra, the hearings are just the beginning of a long fight for justice that will continue for the rest of their lives. Section 6, the aftermath. The Church Committee hearings ended in April 1976, but for MKUltra's victims, the fight for justice was just beginning. The committee's report had officially acknowledged what survivors had known for years. They had been subjected to illegal medical experiments that caused permanent psychological damage. But acknowledgement wasn't compensation, and documentation wasn't justice. The first major lawsuit was filed by the family of Frank Olson in 1976. Armed with newly declassified documents proving that Olson had been murdered rather than committed suicide, his widow Alice sought damages from the CIA for wrongful death. The case should have been straightforward. The government's own documents proved that CIA employees had drugged Olson without his consent, then failed to provide proper medical care when he suffered a psychotic break. His death was the direct result of illegal human experimentation. But the CIA fought the case aggressively, using every legal technicality available to avoid responsibility. They argued that Olson's death occurred too long ago to be prosecuted. They claimed that national security prevented full disclosure of relevant documents. They maintained that any experiments were conducted with proper authorization under wartime emergency powers. The case dragged on for years. Alice Olson, now in her 60s and struggling financially, found herself battling an agency with unlimited resources and no accountability. Finally, in 1976, President Ford intervened personally. In a meeting at the White House, he apologized to the Olson family and offered a settlement of $750,000. It was the first time the U.S. government had officially acknowledged responsibility for MKUltra victims. But the Olson settlement established a troubling precedent. Compensation would come through political negotiation, not legal accountability. The CIA would never face criminal prosecution for MKUltra, and victims would have to fight for every dollar of damages. The next major case involved 9 Canadian victims of Dr. Cameron's experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute. Led by Val Orlikow, they filed suit against both the CIA and the Canadian government in 1980. The legal theory was simple. Both governments had funded illegal medical experiments that violated every principle of informed consent and medical ethics. The victims deserved compensation for lives destroyed by government-sponsored torture. But proving the case was extraordinarily difficult. Most MKUltra documents had been destroyed. Key witnesses were dead. The experiments had been conducted decades earlier, making evidence gathering nearly impossible. Worse, both governments fought the case aggressively. The CIA claimed immunity from Canadian courts. The Canadian government argued that Dr. Cameron's experiments were legitimate medical research, not government operations. The case took 8 years to resolve. In 1988, the CIA finally agreed to pay $850,000 to the 9 plaintiffs, roughly $100,000 each, for lives destroyed by systematic torture. It was a Pyrrhic victory. The settlement came with no admission of wrongdoing, no guarantee that such experiments wouldn't happen again, and no accountability for the officials who had authorized them. Meanwhile, hundreds of other potential victims struggled to prove their cases. The destruction of MKUltra documents made it nearly impossible to verify claims of government experimentation. Many victims had fragmented memories or psychological problems that made them unreliable witnesses. The legal system wasn't designed to handle cases involving systematic government torture disguised as medical research. Courts struggled with questions of evidence, jurisdiction, and liability that had no precedent in American law. Most victims never received any compensation. They were left to deal with the psychological aftermath of government experimentation with no resources beyond their own determination and the support of their families. But the legal battles had accomplished something important. They had established the historical record. Court documents, depositions, and settlement agreements created a permanent archive of MKUltra's crimes that couldn't be classified or destroyed. More importantly, the cases had kept public attention focused on government experimentation. Each lawsuit generated news coverage that reminded Americans of their government's capacity for abuse. By the 1980s, MKUltra had become part of American political consciousness in a way that shaped debates about government power for decades to come. The program's exposure contributed to the rise of the New Right, which used fears of government overreach to build political coalitions. It fueled conspiracy theories that portrayed government agencies as fundamentally untrustworthy. It provided ammunition for libertarian arguments about the dangers of concentrated federal power. But perhaps most importantly, MKUltra changed how Americans thought about medical research and informed consent. The revelation that prestigious universities and respected doctors had participated in government torture experiments sparked a complete overhaul of research ethics. New laws required explicit informed consent for all human research. Institutional review boards were established to oversee medical experiments. The rights of research subjects were codified in federal regulations that remain in effect today. These changes came too late for MKUltra's victims, but they protected future generations from similar abuse. The program also sparked lasting changes in intelligence oversight. Congress established permanent committees to monitor CIA activities. New laws required reporting of covert operations. The intelligence community was forced to operate under legal constraints that hadn't existed during MKUltra's heyday. Again, these reforms came decades too late, but they represented a genuine effort to prevent future programs like MKUltra from ever happening again. The victims themselves fared less well. Many never recovered from the psychological damage inflicted by government experiments. They struggled with memory problems, personality disorders, and relationship difficulties that lasted for the rest of their lives. Val Orlikow, who had sought treatment for a simple postpartum depression and emerged from Dr. Cameron's hospital with permanent brain damage, spent decades trying to rebuild a life that had been shattered by government-sponsored torture. She died in 2014, having never fully recovered the memories destroyed by Cameron's electroshock treatments. Linda McDonald, the young mother who lost 26 years of memories to Cameron's experiments, required lifelong care from her family. She never regained the ability to live independently or maintain complex relationships. The men who survived Isabel's prison experiments at Lexington faced different but equally devastating challenges. Many developed chronic addictions to the drugs they'd been forced to consume. Others suffered permanent psychological problems that made employment and social relationships impossible. Most died in obscurity, their names unknown to the public. They'd served as unwitting test subjects in their government's quest for mind control. But their suffering wasn't meaningless. The exposure of MKUltra fundamentally changed American society's relationship with government power, medical authority, and institutional trust. The program revealed that prestigious institutions, universities, hospitals, government agencies, were capable of systematic evil when proper oversight and ethical constraints were absent. That revelation shaped political discourse, informed consent practices, and civil liberties law for decades to come. MKUltra's victims paid a terrible price for lessons their society needed to learn. Their suffering exposed dangers that future generations could guard against. It was a tragic form of heroism, unwitting martyrs whose pain educated a nation about the capacity for evil that exists within every institution of power. The storm is beginning to pass now. You can hear it in the distance, moving on to other places, other sleepers who need the white noise of rain and thunder to quiet their racing minds. What we've learned tonight isn't easy to carry. The knowledge that our own government conducted systematic torture on its own citizens, that respected doctors violated every principle of medical ethics. Those prestigious universities participated in human experimentation that would have been recognizable to Nazi researchers. These aren't comfortable truths. They challenge fundamental assumptions about institutional authority and governmental restraint. They force us to confront the reality that evil can flourish within the most respected corners of society when proper oversight is absent. But there's something else we've learned tonight, something equally important. These programs were exposed. The victims found their voices. Journalists investigated. Congress held hearings. The legal system, however imperfectly, provided some measure of justice. The same democratic institutions that allowed MKUltra to happen also made its exposure possible. The same government that authorized torture also compensated victims. The same medical establishment that participated in unethical research also reformed its practices to prevent future abuse. This doesn't excuse what happened. It doesn't minimize the suffering of victims like Val Orlikow, Linda McDonald, and the unnamed subjects of Isbell's prison experiments. But it does suggest that institutional evil, however systematic and well protected, is ultimately vulnerable to exposure and accountability. The price of that accountability is eternal vigilance. The willingness to question authority, demand transparency, and insist on ethical constraints even when, especially when, national security is invoked to justify their suspension. MKUltra happened because good people trusted institutions to police themselves. It was exposed because other good people refused to accept institutional denials and demanded the truth. The lesson isn't that all institutions are evil. It's that all institutions are capable of evil when they operate without oversight, accountability, and ethical constraints. That's a lesson each generation must learn for itself. The documents we've reviewed tonight, the testimonies we've heard, the patterns we've traced, these are our democracy's immune system, its way of remembering past infections so it can recognize and resist future ones. As you drift off to sleep tonight, listening to the last echoes of the storm passing overhead, remember the voices of those who suffered so we could understand the dangers they faced. Their pain bought us knowledge. Our responsibility is to use that knowledge wisely, to build better institutions, stronger oversight, and more robust protection for the vulnerable. Sleep well. The storm has passed. The truth endures. And democracy, however imperfect, however fragile, continues its long struggle toward justice. This has been the Sleep Files. I'm Rex Colder. Good night.